Slightly different episode today on the Rise Radio podcast because I'm here on location with Derek McIntyre, who is doing a tour of the UK to bring the truth about Jesus Christ and what evidence there is that he truly did exist and he is who he says he is. So, Derek, really a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, towards the end of this show, we'll talk about where people can go and see this.
Yep.
Because you're still touring on an ongoing basis.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what do you kind of do when you take this around, just briefly, and could you introduce it?
So what we do is I encourage churches to, Christian organisations to host an evening and bring their non-Christian friends, family members, work colleagues along to hear the evidence for Jesus and allow them to make their own mind up. That's what I'm really trying to do, just present the evidence and allow people to draw their own conclusions.
Okay, so because I know there's the book out there that you were inspired by as well, wasn't there? The Case for Christ.
Yes, well, I certainly read the Case for Christ when I started, as the very first thing I did. Now, it didn't turn me into a Christian, but it did act as a starting point to my own investigation into who Jesus is. And I guess the evidence I'm providing is all out there. It's non-contentious stuff. It's stuff that the majority of today's historians that focus on this period of history would agree upon. So I'm just drawing some conclusions from the evidence and allowing people to also draw their own conclusions.
When you talk about the history of Jesus, and your talk is called Jesus the Evidence.
Yep.
I mean, maybe in this generation, people have heard about Jesus and just think maybe he's a religious figure, and there's not much beyond the Bible that would go into who he was.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm doing is, well, first of all, the key thing we mustn't lose sight of is that why are there Christians about today? Why is Christianity the biggest religion on earth? It's clearly something must have happened in the past, some cause that had the effect of compelling some people who weren't the first Christians to become the first Christians. Now, that might sound like stating the obvious, and I suppose it is, but that provides a direct challenge. When and why Christianity started is a historical event. So when and why Christianity started can be studied like any other historical event. As I say in the presentation, historians of all faiths and no faith have been doing this very thing for about 200 years. Key point we mustn't lose sight of is that something pretty momentous must have happened to compel the first Christians to become Christians. Something pretty momentous must have happened, and given all the historical research that's been directed to finding out what happened, all of us can come to our own informed view of what we think happened.
Yeah, because then they say there's actually more evidence for Jesus as a starting point than some of the widely accepted historical figures.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that said before, and I'm sure it's correct. What I'm doing in the evening is looking at the evidence we have for Jesus, and more importantly, asking whether these sources are reliable or not. What I'm saying is not my opinion, but the opinion of today's historians that focus on this period of history. So that's really all I'm trying to do. And yeah, I mean, I guess I make the point, for example, Alexander the Great. We know a lot about Alexander the Great, but we know all about Alexander the Great from a biography written 400 years after he lived, written by Arrian and Plutarch. That's the biography that we base our knowledge of Alexander the Great upon. So, for example, the Gospels. The Gospels were written, Mark's Gospel was probably written around about 60 to 70 AD. That's 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. Where the Gospels of Matthew and Luke written about 10 to 15 years after Mark. And the Gospel of John written about 90 AD. So far closer in time to the example I just gave you of Alexander the Great. But it clearly means that they were written very closely following the date that the events occurred, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So, for example, the Mark's Gospel, 30 to 40 years after Jesus died, that would mean that some of the people who'd actually seen Jesus alive would most likely still be alive. Now, I know life expectancy was shorter in those days, but there's a good chance that some of the people that actually seen Jesus would still be alive and to be available to draw upon for information and, of course, to challenge what was written down if it was inaccurate. So, we're pretty close to the actual events with the Gospels. And I talk in the presentation about, okay, well, that's very interesting, but are they accurate descriptions of what actually happened? And I would say that, well, the answer in part comes from the dates the Gospels were written, insofar as 30 to 40 years elapsing doesn't really give much time for legends and myths to develop about Jesus. Now, there's a general rule amongst historians that the longer the time period between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legends material getting into the narrative. As I said, we're talking about 30 to 40 years. It's not a long time, given they were written so shortly after the events being described. And I talk about other evidence for that as well. The other thing I talk about is Paul's letters, for example. The Christian apostle Paul wrote various letters to various early Christian communities, the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Now, they were written around 15 to 25 years after Jesus died, so all the Paul's letters predate the Gospels. Now, in those letters is clear evidence that Christian worship and belief were already well developed. Now, logic tells you that must have happened earlier than 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. Mm-hmm. So you can see we're getting closer and closer to the actual event with the evidence, if you like. And I should say that historians are generally agreed that the majority of the letters of Paul in the Bible were genuinely written by Paul. Now, that's not to say the other ones are forgeries. It just means that there's more historical debate about some of the other ones. But in those letters, we have clear evidence that, as I say, Christian worship and belief were already well developed at the time of their writing. So we're getting closer and closer to the actual events described in the Gospels and letters of Paul.
And actually, the earliest fragment that there is that's been discovered is in the UK, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That's right. It's a fragment of John's Gospel. Yeah. That was written, it looks like it was written around about 120, 130 AD. So, that's pretty early. And, yeah, indeed. And it looks to be exactly the same as John's Gospel we read today. So it doesn't look as if it's been modified or substantially altered.
Yeah, and that's the passage on that, the conversation with Pilate, isn't it?
Yeah,
where
I think
Jesus
so.
said, "Those are of the truth, hear my voice." I think it's that one, yeah. Very profound and ironic, maybe, yeah. So it's incredible to see, and also, like you just said, just on that point, before we move on to some maybe extra biblical historical evidence, it's interesting, isn't it, that the people around the time that claim to have seen Jesus resurrected, and I know you go into quite a lot of evidence of Jesus' resurrection itself.
Yep.
They were actually claiming to have seen Jesus resurrected, but also willing to die for that claim. And
yes.
Yes,
indeed. I mean, I think it's fair to say, you might say, okay, the disciples were prepared to die for Jesus because they believed in the resurrection. You might say, well, so what? There have been plenty of people since Jesus who have died for their sincerely held beliefs. For example, Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker, bombers of Iraq, Israel and Afghanistan, the London tube bombers, they were prepared to die for what they sincerely believed in. But there's one key difference with the disciples. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died, and they had personally met him after his death, and they were prepared to die for that. What they weren't prepared to die for was some set of beliefs or ideology passed on to them from some other religious leader. Now, that's the situation with the London tube bombers and so on. They've been passed on a philosophy or a religious belief that if they do this, they will, that will be guarantee them a place in paradise, as you know. So, but the disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die for something they had personally seen. So that makes it's a small but very important difference.
That was one of the things that actually brought me back to my faith. These points you're making is a lot different, isn't it? When people actually know whether they've seen something happen or not.
Yes.
And then are willing to actually lay their lives down.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I've seen before online different quotes from sources that are outside the Bible to do with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Which ones of those are true? Because there's some that claim they're from certain people and then they're a bit dubious.
Well, there's a number of. There's a famous one in the writings of Josephus. He mentions Christ, if he, a man of great deeds and miracles and so on and so forth. If you could call him a man. Now there's some debate about that.
Yeah.
And an interpolation. Yeah, it might be an interpolation into the writings of Josephus by a later Christian, possibly. But there's a number of other. There's no uncontestable written evidence for Jesus' life from extra biblical sources, but there are a number of references to the early Christians. And I mentioned one, Tacitus, in his History of Rome. He writes that Nero persecuted Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Now, if you think about this, that means there must have been a Christian community large enough and vocal enough in Rome 35 years after Jesus died to be noticed by the emperor and think, okay, we'll pin this on them. And to use a contemporary example, I use in the presentation, consider asylum seekers in the UK, right? There have been people seeking asylum in the UK for hundreds of years. Way back to the Huguenots in the 18th century and so on. But they've only begun to be seen as a group called asylum seekers when their numbers grew significantly around the turn of the millennium. So the indications are that less than 35 years after Jesus died, there was a Christian community large enough and vocal enough to come to the attention of the emperor. That's pretty amazing, given that it started off in the bottom right-hand corner of the Roman Empire and spread really, really quickly through the empire. It's interesting. People have said that, this is Christianity was a religion was very attractive to slaves and indentured people and poor people and so on, because it gave them hope and so on. That's certainly true, but also it's equally true that it was also an attractive religion to people that were wealthy, people of all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of ethnicities. So it had a universal appeal. I think that's because it has a transformative effect in people's lives. So we talk about that a bit in the presentation as well.
Okay, and what would you point people to when they ask for historical evidence for Jesus?
What I would say is start off with verify for yourself that the historical view of the Gospels is that there were accurate versions of what was originally written. They had described on the whole what actually happened. And then read the Gospels. Read them slowly, and if the bits you don't understand, try and digest that. Ask Christians, do your own research, and see what they say to you. They're pretty radical. They have masses of fundamental truths for the human condition. I would always recommend that people read the Gospels for themselves. Start with Mark's Gospel. It's the one written first. It'll probably take you about an hour and a half to read. It's a very worthwhile thing to do and see what it says to you.
And in this time, there's been some also very exciting discoveries in Israel and different parts of the world relating to the Bible. What are some of the main archaeological evidence?
Yeah, okay. Archaeological evidence provides a generally supportive picture of the details that appear in Paul's letters and the Gospels. I think it would be fair to say that no archaeological finds contradict what was in the Gospels. For example, I talk about a foot bone that was found in a Jewish tomb in Jerusalem. It's a foot bone that's got a nail through it. And prior to that bone being found, if you'd asked a historian what happened to the victims of crucifixion, they would have said they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside of Jerusalem, where the body was eaten by wild animals and dogs. Well, that foot bone with a nail through it, found in a Jewish tomb, indicates at least one person got a proper Jewish burial after they were crucified. And of course, that is a detail in the Gospels that ties up with, obviously the foot bone isn't Jesus, but it indicates that at least some people got a proper Jewish burial.
Yeah, because the Romans did crucify quite a number of
Jewish
people.
Yeah, I think these days we don't get the full implications of being crucified. It's a terrible way to die, obviously, but it was regarded as a really shameful way to die. It's not the way that you would want your Messiah to die, because it was a really shameful death. We've got to remember that the culture in first century Judea and Galilee was one of these honour-shame cultures. You did the maximum possible to garner honour for yourself and to avoid shame from your community. Crucifixion was a very, very shameful death. That was it was regarded as. And you can see the way it's described in the Gospels, even death on a cross, it's an appalling way to die, because it was a shameful way to end your life. So it's unusual that Jesus died that way, insofar as it was a really shameful way to die. It kind of makes sense given Jesus' message and the stuff around about Jesus, but it's incredible. There are a number of features of the resurrection story that look to be just odd. For example, the disciples running away. That's a really shameful thing to do. You're leaving your master and your rabbi and your leader hanging on a cross and running away and hiding. That's what they did. That was a really shameful thing to do. And the criterion of embarrassment is often cited as a way, if something is embarrassing in historical writing, it's more likely to be true, because it really paints them in a very, very bad light.
Yeah.
For example, Peter denying Christ 3 times. That's an incredibly shameful thing to do. And so it's probably more likely true. Jesus' female followers finding the tomb empty it's a terrible thing to happen in ancient writings, because women weren't regarded as reliable witnesses. They were regarded, they couldn't give evidence in court and so on. So, the fact that they found them, it would have been so much better for the first Christians if Peter and John had found them. But it didn't happen like that. So it's probably most likely that's a detail that's embarrassing, and most likely as a result that it probably did happen that way.
Yeah, not the sort of thing you would expect to find in myths and legends.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also you cover, I believe, because for a while a lot of people didn't believe there was necessarily a historical figure called Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
But then they found a stone.
Yes, indeed.
His name on it.
Indeed they did. And yes, it's interesting. Pontius Pilate looks as if he was an appointee of a guy called Sejanus. He was, the Emperor Tiberius had decided to go into semi-retirement in Rome and basically put control of the empire in the hands of the head of the Praetorian Guard, as I say, this fella called Sejanus. Pontius Pilate looks to be one of his placemen. He put a whole lot of people in places of authority around the empire to obviously shore up his position. But Tiberius decided that he was getting too big for his boots, so had him murdered and his family murdered. and it retook control of the empire. Of course, that then meant all these placemen around the empire were desperate to show their loyalty to the emperor. And it's interesting, in John's Gospel, the Jewish authorities say to Pilate, if, pointing to Jesus, this man claims to be king of the Jews. We've only got one king, but that's King Caesar. If you let this man live, you're no friend of Caesar's. So it's applying a bit of subtle pressure on Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate was a notoriously irascible and capricious man. He never paid any attention to anybody. He did what he liked. But interestingly enough, he pays attention to that and has Jesus crucified, of course. So that kind of indicates possibly, I'm just saying possibly, that the date for the crucifixion and the resurrection, there's two dates put around AD 30 or AD 33. If that is relevant, it's most likely it was AD 33. And if we look back and we extrapolate back the dating system we have today, it would have been the crucifixion on the 3rd of April, AD 33, and the resurrection on the 5th of April, AD 33. And of course, that's, interestingly enough, is when Easter is this year. Just a bit of interest. And one of the things that happened on the 3rd of April, AD 33, is that a blood moon would have been visible in Jerusalem. And back in those days, a blood moon was regarded as a very, very bad sign. So it's just mentioning. It's apropos nothing, just it's an interesting point. Anyway, well, I think it's an interesting point.
Is there evidence for any of the other celestial events at the time of Jesus, like the earthquake or the darkness and things like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, people have found some evidence for these things. Whether it's strong enough evidence to talk about in my presentation, what I try and do is avoid anything that has a hint of contentiousness about it. For example, I don't talk about the Turin Shroud. Some people are convinced that the Turin Shroud is genuine, but there are dissenting views on that. So I just leave that to one side. And things like the earthquake and so on, I don't talk about.
Right.
Because I don't want to be talking about anything that is potentially contentious.
Yeah.
I think there's enough solid evidence that nobody can argue with to provide a concrete case for Jesus.
Right, and that's the main thing, isn't it? Like, because we know that if the Bible is true, then these things would have happened.
Yes, indeed.
So, yeah, it's not about every single little detail, but I wanted to ask you, as we come towards the last part of our interview, your mission across the UK is to spread the truth. There is evidence for Jesus, and he is the true Messiah.
Well, look, I guess the key thing I'm trying to do here is, right, I'm not from a Christian background. I didn't go to church as a child. My parents aren't Christians. The only person in my family that's a Christian is my daughter. And when I became a Christian, I thought, I had to do all this digging about for information. That got me into a position where I could consider the possibility of a relationship with Jesus Christ. And once I became a Christian, after a couple of years, I thought, there's plenty of people out in the world like me, need some evidence to hang on to. There's cussed people like me. So I thought, wouldn't it be good if I could collect all this information together and present that to people and allow them to make their own mind up? So that's the purpose of the thing. I'm not going to convince anybody to become a Christian. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. But you have to be in a receptive frame of mind, if you like. You have to think that there might be something in this to allow the possibility of you being able to consider a relationship. Well, some people certainly are in that people like me are in that kind of condition. So that's why I do it.
Right, and the truth that goes through your mind first before it reaches your heart.
Well, that's some people. I mean, I know plenty of people. They just know it in their heart. It's true. That's fantastic, but it's not me, unfortunately. So, I'm trying to, I guess, focus on the people that, the cussed people like me, that need something to hang on to, something to get them into a position where they can consider the possibility of a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, the thing about it is, why bother? You might ask yourself, why bother? All I can say is my life has been transformed as a result of my relationship with Jesus Christ. I was an angry workaholic, still got a bit of a temper, but it's had the corners knocked off it. And my relationships with my family, my wife, my children, my parents has improved immeasurably. I'm not a completely different person, but a substantially different person. I'm a better version of who I was as a result of the relationship I have with Jesus Christ. So it is definitely worthwhile looking at this. So that's why I'm doing it.
And do you feel the UK and the world really needs this message? Right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, you only have to look at the world and you can see that's, Jesus' message is truly radical. What would the world be like if we loved our enemies? It would be very, very different. We did good to those that persecuted us. Mental. But it would be very, very different. And so, yeah, I mean, that's why I do it. That's why I think it's important to let people have the chance of experiencing that, that relationship.
Thank you, Derek. It's really been good to speak to you today. I think I'll just ask this last question to you to kind of round off what you're doing. Christianity really stands and falls on the resurrection of Jesus, because if there's no resurrection, there's no hope in Christianity.
Correct.
So this is the most integral part of our faith. So do you believe that, aside from what the Bible says, which is obviously, as you've proven, very reliable, and faith, do you believe there is a way to convey the resurrection of Jesus Christ is both miraculous and historical?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say there's enough historical evidence pointing to the resurrection being an actual historical event. So, but what do you do with that information? That's the key thing. If you get to the position where you think, yeah, that looks most likely it did happen. So, well, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with that information? That's the important thing. You have to ask yourself the question, what does it mean for my life and my relationships and what I do with the rest of my life? And you won't be disappointed if you decide that it is real and I'm going to follow Jesus. It will make a tremendous difference to your own life, undoubtedly. I've never heard of anybody becoming a Christian, becoming a follower of Jesus, and thinking, well, that was rubbish. It's always a positive transformation.
So if someone is listening to this from across the UK, we've got some listeners who from different areas, where can they see your tour? And it's ongoing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. You can go on the website, www.jesustheevidence.com, go to the page Future Presentations, and you'll see all the dates I've got organised. I've got dates organised between now and June and between August and Christmas time. And I'm pretty much everywhere. So I'm sure you'll find somewhere that's close to you if you want to hear this. And of course, you can go on the website. If you want a copy of the booklet, I'm more than happy to send you a copy free of charge. So,
and this booklet is really good. You've laid out all the different evidences.
Yeah, I mean, the booklet, I give the booklet out at the end of the presentation because I know I'm firing a lot of information at people and it's very difficult to take it in with one hearing. So the idea is the booklet covers everything I cover in the presentation and then some, so people can go away and digest it at their leisure and come to their own conclusions.
And your talks and this booklet are also really good for people with family members that they're trying to kind of explain the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a cussed person like me in your family, this would be the ideal thing to give them. And you can obviously have a sensible conversation about the contents of it afterwards, after they've had a chance to have a look at it.
Well, Derek, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you today and to hear all of this evidence that you've got. And there's even more in this booklet we have here. And I just encourage people to go and check out your website.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Rise Radio.
Thank you.